All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the meeting of the Automotive Right to Repair Working Group. I'm Chris Taub from the Attorney General's office, and with me is Christina Moylan, our Chief of Consumer Protection. As we do at the beginning of every meeting, why don't we go around and introduce ourselves? And Megan, can I ask to start with you on the right?
Hi, everyone. My name is Megan Sway. I'm the Policy Director at the ACLU of Maine.
I'm Lynn Gardner. I'm the Director of Legal Affairs for the Bureau of Motor Vehicle, and I'm here on behalf of the Secretary of State.
I'm Elizabeth Frazier. I'm a partner at Pierce Atwood, and I'm here on behalf of the vehicle manufacturers, the Alliance of Automotive Innovators.
Hi, I'm Jeff Groves. I'm here on behalf of the aftermarket retailers and distributors.
Yeah, can you briefly introduce yourself with your mic on?
I'm sorry. Jeff Groves here on behalf of the aftermarket retailers and distributors.
Jack Quirk Auto Group.
Tommy Hickey, the director of the Maine Automotive Right to Repair Coalition.
And Brian?
This is Brian Boggs from Tesla, representing an auto manufacturer.
Katrina?
And Katrina Fitzgerald with the Electronic Privacy Information Center.
And Eric?
Eric Leptig with Dorman Products.
Great. All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. So we circulated a few documents either last week or the week before. One of them was sort of a summary that Christina and I put together of some examples of different sorts of governmental and sort of quasi-governmental entities that we thought could potentially sort of serve as examples or models that this group might want to consider looking to. And then the other one was, I guess what we're calling sort of a decision log or decision tree that we just tried to identify some of the basic sort of decision points that we think that the group needs to decide as part of the recommendations it's going to be making to the legislature. I'm not sure if we got every point on here, so there might be some things that we left off that we need to add, but we tried to get the ones that we thought were the ones that were most pressing. As you'll see, the only decision that we think we've made so far, and I think we have a consensus that the entity is not going to be hosting a platform, or it's not going to maintain any data on its own. So let me just look around the room and just see if there's anyone who objects to that consensus recommendation. All right, Alex, I'm not seeing any objections. So just to get so what I thought we're sort of to the point where I think fairly soon what I'd like to have happen is that based on sort of the feedback and thoughts and hopefully consensus of this group, Christina and I can go back and start actually drafting a report to the legislature, which then we would circulate to all of you folks before our next meeting. And that would sort of start to serve as sort of the focus for our discussions. I'm sure people will have, comments or edits or changes that they want to make, but I think we're sort of close to that. I'm not sure whether after this meeting, Christina and I are going to be in a position to sort of put pen to paper. But my hope is if not this meeting, the next meeting, we could do that. And while I'm thinking of it for our next meeting, I don't think I sent the email out yet, but we're looking at December 2nd at 2 p.m. For our next meeting after this one, and we will get that circulated. So what I wanted to do is I've been thinking about this a lot, and I just wanted to sort of throw out some thoughts that I've had about what this independent entity should look like. And I think that to some extent, I think there might be a disconnect between sort of what the statute contemplates the independent entity doing and what I think a lot of the members of the working group think the independent entity should be doing. And just to give you examples, it talks about the independent entity managing cybersecure access to motor vehicle generated data. It talks about the independent entity identifying and adopting standards for implementation. It talks about creating policies for compliance, monitoring and develop policies for the evolving use and availability of data generated by the operation of motor vehicles. So there are a lot of things that the statute sort of suggests this independent entity is going to be doing. and I might be wrong, and so maybe there's not the consensus here that I think that there might be. But it seems to me that to a large degree, the statute is really self-effectuating in terms of what it requires manufacturers to do. I mean, it sets forth the requirements for how manufacturers have to provide access. And those provisions don't really seem to hinge on the independent entity. So what I'm sort of, I guess, I have this, and I'm not sure if I can articulate this very clearly, but let me give it a shot. I'm sort of wondering if, at least initially, this independent entity should really be sort of an advisory or organization made up of stakeholders from the different parts of the industry, kind of like this group is. And initially, this entity would not have any rulemaking authority. It wouldn't have any direct enforcement authority. It probably wouldn't have a staff or a budget. But what it would do is it would periodically meet. It would review sort of how manufacturers are complying with the right to repair law. It would field complaints. So if there's a manufacturer, if there's a independent repair facility or a consumer that feels that they're not getting access to the data that the way they should, they could take that to this entity, and the entity could try to resolve the dispute. If it can't resolve the dispute, it could refer the matter to the AG's office for enforcement. Another thing that Christine and I were thinking about is this independent entity is probably not going to, be meeting every week. It's probably going to be meeting more like, 4 or 6 times a year or something like that. So we'd want to have some sort of ability to sort of deal with complaints on a more timely matter. So one thought we had is maybe this independent entity could develop sort of a list of like experts that the AG's office could consult with, sort of recognize people that the independent entity is comfortable that they would be able to sort of give us advice and help us decide on sort of the merits or format of an enforcement action. So it would do those things. And then the other thing it would be doing is it would be sort of just seeing how this is going. So, this is going to be a brand new statute. We're not really sure what compliance is going to look like or how it's going to look like. I think we're sort of envisioning that and again, if I'm wrong, I'll stop in a few minutes and people can say they have a different view. But I think what we're contemplating is that manufacturers are going to sort of decide on their own how they're going to provide the access to consumers. So it's not going to be sort of a set format where every manufacturer has to use the same format. So, I sort of see the independent entity kind of looking at how that's going. Is it working smoothly? Is the way that manufacturers are providing the data, is it sort of meeting what the consumer's expectations are? Are there roadblocks that are being thrown up either intentionally or unintentionally? Sort of how's the system working? And then sort of the next piece would be then this independent entity would be charged with making a report every year to the legislative committee. And it would sort of itemize or describe to the committee the work it's done during the past year. And then this is the important thing also, is that it would make recommendations to the committee as to what, if any, additional authority the independent entity needs. So for example, if the independent entity concludes that there's just too many different ways that the information is being provided and it's become really cumbersome for independent repair shops to deal with 16 different manufacturers' formats, maybe the independent entity wants to ask the legislature for authority to implement rules that would sort of standardize the process. And this is a point that I think has come up before, if there's a concern that some of the information that consumers are asking to be turned over to the repair facilities, if there's a concern that, maybe some of these repair facilities aren't above board, maybe there needs to be some sort of vetting process or credentialing process, the independent entity might recommend to the legislature, hey, we want rulemaking authority to be able to adopt a credentialing process. But I think it's hard because we don't really know what this is going to look like yet. It's kind of hard, at least in my mind, to sort of make recommendations for those specific things now. And so that's why I'm sort of thinking that we get this independent entity off the ground. We make it mostly advisory. They resolve disputes. They refer actions to the AG's office. and they look at how the system is working and then make recommendations to the legislature if things don't seem to be working smoothly, or if they think there's some additional enforcement authority or rulemaking authority or regulatory authority that they need. Christina, is there anything else that you think that we talked about that I didn't mention? Okay. So that was a lot. Let me stop there. I'm hoping maybe people can chime in and sort of just give at least overall impressions of this kind of concept. Yeah, let me start with Jack.
I think you've cleared up in my mind because it's hard for me to come up with a specific way to this entity to be because not knowing how the manufacturers are going to put this all together. It's kind of like putting the cart before the horse type of situation. So I like your thinking on this. I almost totally agree with what you're saying, that we need to see how the process works first before we can actually advise how this entity is going to work. Because we still don't know whether the manufacturers are going to comply or not. What happens if some of them don't? It happens in Massachusetts. If it happens here in Maine, will the entity force them to do that or not? How would that work if a manufacturer said, we're not playing?
Yeah, so in my mind, at least, what would happen is the independent entity would first try to work with the manufacturer and sort of try to use their power of persuasion and the fact that they are an entity that's made up of all the different parts of the industry to try to, get the manufacturer to comply with their obligations. But if that's not possible, then the next step would be the independent entity could refer the matter to the Attorney General's office, and then our office would take a look at the matter and, depending on the facts and the circumstances, potentially bring an enforcement action against the manufacturer.
Is there a drop dead date of when this all has to be done with the manufacturers?
Well, so the law is currently in effect. So most of the provisions of the statute are in effect now. The telematics piece of it, so that's paragraph 6 in the statute, which talks about that what manufacturers that sell cars that have a telematics system have to do. That takes effect 1 year from the effective date of the statute, and I think that 1 year date is around like January 5th or 6th. So
Of 25?
Of 25. So that's the date when the telematics requirements are going to kick into place.
Boy, working with a lot of different manufacturers, I don't know how they're going to get that done so early. Boy, that's
Well, I mean, the statute's been on the books
Yeah.
for over a year now. No, not quite, I guess. It's been almost on the books for a year. But wait and see what happens, I guess.
I haven't heard anything from any manufacturer about we're ready to go or anything like that. So it'll be interesting to see what they come up with.
I just wanted to follow up on your question, Christina Moylan from the Attorney General's office. I just wanted to follow up on your question too about what to do if a manufacturer just says, no, I'm not doing it. And I think if it's just, no, I'm not doing it because I don't want to do it because I don't like the law, I think the path is what Chris laid out. I think if it is a manufacturer saying, I'm not going to do this because I have no idea how, there's not enough information in the statute. I think if the entity is getting information about that, I think that is a signal that more needs to happen. Like they'd have to ask the legislature for rulemaking authority or something to kind of clear up what some of the confusion is. And that's one of the things that's contemplated in the model that Chris laid out.
I'd also just add to Jack's point, this technology has been in vehicles for 10, 15 years. So this isn't new for car manufacturers to know that this is coming down the pipeline. So they've had a ample amount of time to make sure that this law can be implemented. But to Chris's point about kind of your view from this group and all the input, I think it's all good and well. I think the entity should always be working with the Attorney General's office, with being the consumer protector too. So having this entity submit a report to the AG's office, and then if there needs to be, a legislative report after, I definitely think that this entity should be at the disposal of the Attorney General's office in the implementation of this. So just a small nuance, but I think it's important to keep the AG's office kind of front and center with this entity.
Any other? Yeah, Elizabeth.
Thank you. Yeah, so I think, excuse me, I think what you just laid out generally makes a lot of sense, given the conversations that we've had and sort of our points of concern. I don't think you have the answer to this yet, so I'm only bringing it up as a discussion point. One of my concerns is that it's hard to. There is a disconnect, right, between what the statute says and what we're talking about now, I think. And some of that is like written word disconnect. So it's going to be a little hard to say like, yes, absolutely to this without knowing that the same statutory fixes are coming in, because right now these two things can't go together. That no one could comply, right? It just wouldn't make sense. So to that point, I think I know we're not quite there yet, but that's just on my mind as we think about the layout. But what you described, I think, is generally where everyone has been headed. So I think that makes sense. I will also just piggyback off of Mr. Quirk's concerns. Obviously, many of you know, if you've been to dealership to buy a car, they're often model year to a couple of years ahead, and that's how they plan things out. So oftentimes, cars are well in the pipeline. So while the law was passed a year ago, many of those cars had already been designed and were being manufactured, so that there's a little bit of a time lag there with vehicle design, which even the federal government exists as a reality. So I think we can all acknowledge that. And I think for the moment, that's it for me. I think I just wanted to, I guess you said, the entity might go back and ask for rulemaking authority. That makes sense. I think in those instances where that would happen, it would be essentially seeking new statutory language, which would then provide authority, and you could hash that out at the time or whatever. But so that makes sense to me. But it's really the tricky part about sort of not having the language and saying yes, if that makes sense. But what you generally outlined, I think, is on the right track.
Yeah, and just to respond to that, I mean, you've definitely put your finger on a big issue, that there is this disconnect between the statute and sort of, I think, what we're all envisioning the role is for the independent entity. And I know that historically the legislature is loath to tinker with enactments that have gone through the citizen initiative process like this one did. But what my hope is that if all of us are on board with making some recommendations to change the statute, I think the legislature will hopefully feel a lot more comfortable in making some changes if they recognize that there's broad support across the board. And to your other point, Elizabeth, I am sort of envisioning that our report to the legislature is going to sort of include like a narrative section or a description, but it's also going to have proposed amendments to the actual statutory language. And I know that it's hard in the abstract to think about that, but what I'm thinking is that if we have sort of the concept down, then Christina and I go back to our desks and we come back with some draft language that we would propose. And the devil's in the details, but at least, there'd be specific language that you would be looking at before you decide that this is the road that we want to go.
That sounds perfect. And with having said that, I think the outline you gave is generally the right path.
Let me start with Jeff. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me just start with Jeff first.
Jeff Groves, I think your approach, Chris, is thoughtful, and I'm supportive of it. I think that I think the manufacturers probably have a good understanding already about how they might accomplish this. I know in a letter to the Department of Commerce in April of this year, the Alliance expressed that they have to figure out how to transmit data this way. So I think that can happen, and so I'm hopeful that it will. But I think it's hard to solve for a problem until you know exactly how the parties are going to act or react. So I'm supportive of your approach in that way. I want to make sure that I understand correctly. What you're suggesting would do nothing, though, to change the language with respect to the private right of action. So if this group meets 4 to 6 times a year, if there was a party that felt particularly aggrieved, they would still have the right under the statute to have a private right of action.
Yeah, that's a good question. And so a couple of things. The answer is correct. I'm not envisioning tinkering with that. The only part, well, I think there's some other changes to the statute that are just sort of cosmetic. I think there's some unintended drafting errors, which at some point I can describe that we should fix. But substantively, the only sections of the statute that I'm thinking really need to be changed would be in section 1810, just paragraph 1 and paragraph 2. So I'm not envisioning making
So is
any
that 2?
changes. I'm sorry?
So you're talking about 2, right? Like the independent entity under 18?
Yeah, so I'm talking about the access to diagnostic systems paragraph because there is a reference to the entity there, which we might need to tinker with. And then I think the biggest change would be in paragraph 2,
Yeah.
where I think which is called an independent entity, which I think we would just be sort of redrafting what the independent entity is going to be doing, and it would sort of outline the fact that, you know, it's going to be monitoring compliance, it's going to be helping the Attorney General with enforcement, and it's going to be required to make a report once a year to the Committee of Jurisdiction to make any recommendations for future legislation.
Okay, I just want to know that, wanted folks to know that we're specifically talking about that section on this. 'Cause
Yeah.
that was right.
Yeah, so for example, like the substantive paragraphs that address the actual requirements that manufacturers have to comply with, I'm not envisioning tinkering with those, except there are a couple of things that I think just have some errors in it that we need to fix. And then Jeff, the other point is that people would always be free to refer matters directly to the AG's office. And that's why Christine and I were thinking that it might be helpful. I mean, we were sort of just trying to envision like how we would go to an independent entity for help when it's this big body that's only going to be meeting a certain number of times a year. So that's why I sort of suggested this idea that maybe the independent entity could like designate an expert or experts that our office could consult with, so we don't have to like wait for the next meeting or, you know. Did that address your questions?
Yes.
Okay, all right. And there was someone online, I don't know if it was Brian?
Yes, this is
Eric?
Brian Boggs from Tesla. So I think what you laid out is very thoughtful and makes some sense. Given the clarifications that we might recommend for the statutory language, for example, if we come to the conclusion that the independent entity is fulfilling this advisory role as opposed to being a direct administrator of a digital platform, then that clarifies to the manufacturers that they need to implement this capability on their side rather than integrating with a not yet created digital system that the independent entity or somebody else would administer. So that clarification would be coming now or whenever we publish our report and if the language gets updated. Do you think that what one of our recommendations might be to change the 1-year compliance date for that portion? Otherwise, like you can't really say that the manufacturers have had a year to comply if it was unknown up until the change in the statutory language, if they need to integrate with the not yet created digital system versus utilize what they have on their side. What do you think?
So I think there were 2 questions in there. The first question about sort of the clarification that the entity is not going to be managing or have access to the data. I think what we would do is we would both say in the report that that's the consensus of the working group, that this independent entity is not going to have control over the information or it's not going to be a repository for it. And then I'm also thinking in the sort of attached proposed statutory language that we'd be attaching, we would clarify that in the statute as well. To your second question, I suspect there's not going to be consensus in this group that the effective date for the telematics part should be postponed. But as I said at the beginning of our meetings, you know, while our hope was that we would get consensus on everything, I think we all recognize that we might not have consensus on every single point. And so certainly if there are members of the group who want the legislature to postpone the effective date, I think we can say that in the report. You know, the following members, you know, for the following reasons, think that the effective date should be postponed. But I'm reasonably confident that there's not going to be a consensus on that point.
Okay, well, maybe that is a thing that we can discuss later as we go through the decision log and the recommendations and see if we can get consensus.
Yeah, I mean, maybe we should just tackle that right now. I don't know, because I don't think that point's specifically in the decision log. But
Here, maybe if I can take a moment to frame at least how I'm thinking about it.
yeah,
I, as a manufacturer, won't actually know until the statutory language is updated whether I can utilize this authorization platform that I've developed for the vehicles that I distribute and manufacture and sell, or if instead I need to integrate with a digital platform that the independent entity designs and creates. And so I don't actually today know which of those two paths I need to pursue by January 5th. And so if and so the 1 year of duration of time to comply, I don't actually yet know what to comply with. And so I think to me, it seems reasonable that if we're coming to the conclusion that the independent entity is this advisory role and it's not designing and creating this authorization platform that manufacturers would need to integrate into their vehicles, then it seems reasonable to move out the date, as otherwise the date was again something that was not yet clarified.
yeah, Jack.
You know, when I see that January 5th, 2025, I hope that if us dealers who have thousands of vehicles on our lot are going to be able to sell them January 6th, 2025, if the manufacturers aren't ready, you know, that would be devastating to the economy. Yeah, loss of job, you know, we wouldn't be able to operate. So I don't know if the cars that we have on our lot right now comply or not comply, but you know, we get back from the holidays. I want to be in business and all the dealers want to be in business to sell these vehicles. You know, I hope someone's going to have that answer before Christmas. So we know where we stand.
Well, maybe I was being presumptuous in thinking that this wouldn't be a consensus. Are there folks on the group who would be okay with pushing back the compliance date?
Yeah, you were right to think there'd be no consensus. I
I
mean,
had a feeling.
this whole idea that cars can't be sold because of that there's nothing in this bill that prohibits that. So I would alleviate that concern. And look, I think that Section 6 is clear as day. It says that manufacturers are to create this platform. So I think, like I said, this technology has been around for over a decade in a lot of manufacturers, and I think they've had plenty of time to kind of figure this out or come to the table for a legitimate compromise. And this is what folks voted for at 84%. And unless we hear a good reason as to why, I don't see any reason why we should ever delay this law or delay this section of it.
Any other thoughts? Yeah. Megan?
We could delay the changed version, but we can't delay what's currently set for January 2025 because the legislature can't act that fast. So it may be that the Attorney General doesn't enforce, and that's something that the Attorney General, guidance the Attorney General should give out, but we are not able to change it by January. Like, there's no way for the legislature to act by January to change it. So you're going to need an advisory opinion probably from the AG's office, I would think.
Yeah, that's a great point. I hadn't even thought about that. Yeah, any other thoughts or comments about postponing?
Is
Jack?
this just for vehicles that are sold on January 5th, or is it vehicles that we've already sold that this law goes into effect? You know, where's the cutoff? You know, I just, where does it start? Is it, anything sold after the January 5th that law takes into effect on these customers? Or is it all customers that have already bought vehicles? You know, where does it start? I guess all I'm trying to convey is that I can see a lot of customers coming into dealerships asking these questions when it comes out in the public that, January 6th, you're allowed to supposedly go to the cloud, get the information, and have someone work on your car. You know, so if I have a Toyota in my garage, am I going to be able to fix it? Since I'm a Chevy dealer, you know, how's it all, you know, is it an old Toyota or the one that someone just bought? You know, how do you know what qualifies and what doesn't, I guess? So just,
Jeff?
Really don't think that the statute really is about the sale of vehicles, certainly. And so it certainly wouldn't prohibit that. You know, to the extent that, you know, manufacturers are including telematics in their vehicles, they also provide warranties that are, you know, somewhere between 3 and 5 years. And the fact of the matter is that most of these issues, the vast majority of these issues are all issues that will probably, Jack, come back to you as the dealer, not as the repairer of a used vehicle that you have sold on your lot. And so, you know, I think this is really about the repair of the vehicle and whether or not, you know, the repairer has the data that the repairer needs. And so, you know, I think that it certainly can have that information, and the manufacturers can make that available. And probably can make that available in fairly short order. I do agree with the comment that obviously it's up to the Attorney General's office to decide whether or not on an interim basis you're going to enforce after January the 5th. But I would not be supportive of any extension with respect to the deadline.
This is Brian Boggs. Just speaking as a vehicle manufacturer that designs and sells and then distributes vehicles. Jack's question does have some relevance. When we, Tesla, deliver a vehicle for the very first time, like the very first registered owner of the vehicle, at the conclusion of like the financial transaction of that sale and the vehicle gets handed over for delivery, there's a number of electronic changes that take place on the vehicle to essentially transfer it from being a factory produced vehicle that is owned by Tesla as the manufacturer to now being a vehicle owned by a private customer, and some electronic information changes on the vehicle. It's now marked as delivered. Their profiles get uploaded to the car. Some digital certificates change on the vehicle in a unidirectional way where they can't be changed back. And it's essentially all to facilitate the first sale of a vehicle. So that this I would not put within the scope of repair and maintenance information. It's somewhat unique in the world of software-defined vehicles, especially upon the first delivery. And vehicle manufacturers and dealerships utilize telematics to facilitate this original sale of a vehicle. So I could envision that maybe some manufacturers might struggle on having 6-ish weeks to design and develop software in a way that wouldn't actually put Jack or dealerships potentially at risk of some unintended change impacting their business workflow.
Yeah, Christina?
I have a question for you, Brian. I guess I'm a little confused about the operation of subsection 6 and whether it creates kind of freestanding, independent requirements of manufacturers that are irrespective of whatever the independent entity might have looked like or might look like. Is that not your reading of subsection 6 that imposes some obligation on manufacturers to make this information available regardless of whatever's going on with an independent entity?
So I think that was part of what this working group has been debating for the past couple months. When I first read this bill and I read section 2 and section 6 together, it was unclear whether section 6, when it's talking about that manufacturers are required to equip vehicles with an interoperable, standardized, and owner-authorized access platform, whether that was referring to the access platform described in section 2, that the independent entity was to establish and administer access to this platform. So it seems like us as a working group, we're hopefully coming to a consensus that no, these two things are separated, but with the current wording, that's much less clear. And so until the statutory language is updated, I could still interpret this as meaning that the vehicle manufacturer must equip the vehicles that they manufacture with the access platform that the independent entity was charged with creating. So if we can clarify the statutory language, then yes, I would agree with you that section 2 and 6 become more distinct.
So it sounds, Brian, that what you're saying is that sort of before we had these discussions in the working group, there was an interpretation of section 2 and 6 that could have led manufacturers to understand that until this independent entity is up and running and establishes the platform, the telematics requirements aren't in effect? Is that is sort of
right,
contingent on?
It's contingent. I don't know that they're not in effect.
That's what I meant. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah, Elizabeth.
Yeah, and we all had the same reading, and so did the entire IDEA committee last year. That was our interpretation of the law.
So I mean, there's a couple issues that are going on here. I mean, first, as Megan pointed out, this report. Well, so this report is not even going to go to the committee until the end of February, and then short of emergency legislation. I think, short of emergency legislation, any changes to the statute wouldn't take effect until, was it 60 days, 90 days after 90 days after the end of the legislative session. So we're talking like August or September. But then there's also the issue that I think there's just sort of a divergence of views on whether the effective date should be delayed. And I'm not suggesting, Brian, that you're not making some good arguments. But I guess what I'm thinking is that we will have a place in the report for those who think that the effective date should be delayed, or that the Attorney General should, postpone enforcement, where those parties can sort of make their pitch and make their arguments, and then anyone who wants to sort of sign on to those arguments is free to do so, recognizing that there's probably going to be some other people who are going to be saying, no, like, we think this law needs to take effect on January 5th or January 6th. So I don't know what else to do with this except just have a place in the report where people can sort of make their pitches.
It makes sense to me.
Yeah.
Lynn, did you have something?
Yeah. It didn't go.
Mhm.
What I was thinking didn't go to this question.
That's
It's from
okay.
Before.
Yeah.
Back at where we started with your proposal for the advisory body, I thought that made a lot of sense from a logistical perspective, and that it would evolve over time as experience was gained. But a couple of pieces that are just still questions in my mind are sort of, to what extent and exactly how would that entity be involved in resolving disputes? And the other piece is, this law speaks to individual owners of vehicles, not just repair shops. So how do they fit in for all of that?
Yeah, so those are good questions, to be honest. Christine and I were struggling over those kinds of questions earlier today. And I think one of the challenges is that, as I said before, like, this independent entity is not going to be just like an agency that exists somewhere in state government where someone can just pick up the phone and make a complaint. It's going to be a body that's going to get together a certain number of times a year, and is going to have to do things as a group. Having said that, one thing we were thinking is that if either a vehicle owner or a repair shop, I think a repair shop could sort of be advocating for its customers, they could ask the independent entity at their next meeting that, they be allowed to, bring a complaint about a specific manufacturer that they believe isn't complying. That's kind of, I think, not going to give any immediate help to people because of sort of the timing of that. But then I think another idea is that people can also make their complaints directly to the Attorney General's office. The challenge for us is that, we're not going to have the technical expertise necessarily to be able to evaluate the complaint, which is why I was thinking that maybe the independent entity could designate certain individuals that could be available to us. Like I'm thinking technical experts, so that we could go to these people if we can't wait for the next meeting of the entity.
And so if that sort of enforcement piece is happening, if a complaint, say, comes directly to the Attorney General's office, are you envisioning having some level of investigatory activity at the Attorney General's office?
Yeah. So another good question, and I think it's hard to speculate because we don't know how many complaints we're going to be getting, or what those complaints are going to look like. I will say that, our office in other areas that it regulates, or that it sort of, has investigatory and enforcement, we don't investigate every single complaint that comes in the door. But if we see a pattern, so if we see that a particular entity, we have multiple complaints about that entity, then that's going to sort of rise up the level of our priority. So in like this context, what I'm thinking is I can't say that if we get, 6 complaints in a week against 6 different manufacturers that we're necessarily going to investigate each one of those. But if we get a bunch of complaints against a particular manufacturer, that would cause us to think, well, there's something going on here that we need to look into. That's not a great answer, but I think it's hard to know until we see what's going to happen. And Christina, let me ask you if you have any.
Yeah, I guess I'm wondering if what you're getting at, Lynn, is that the current version of the statute contemplates that the independent entity would be making referrals to the Attorney General for investigation and enforcement. Is that what you're referring to? Like, can we independently investigate and enforce without it coming through the independent entity? Is that what your question is?
I think my question sort of goes more to the sense that if you've got a complaint coming from an auto repair facility, it's going to be a more sophisticated player who is able to give you a lot more relevant information, as opposed to if it is an individual who perhaps doesn't quite know how to make their case. And so, what would you do with those?
I think that's a great example of why we would want to be able to tap into some technical expertise, that we would think that this advisory committee would have a pre-approved roster of experts that might give us some help in that regard. But on the issue of whether we can just independently initiate a complaint in between the independent entity referring something to us, that's a good question. I mean, the statute doesn't say that a violation of the statute is a violation of the Unfair Trade Practices Act, where we have some very specific tools and investigative processes. So I guess food for thought, whether if we develop a model like this, where the entity itself wouldn't have any enforcement authority, and would meet relatively infrequently, but that there has to be an ability in between for complaints to get considered, that it might be worth considering whether the enforcement section needs a little revision to make that clear.
Yeah, Elizabeth?
Yeah, I'll just this doesn't even really have anything to do with me per se, but I was just reading the enforcement section, and yeah, you probably might want to take a look at that just to make sure you have your own enforcement authority. I did want to just backtrack just a little bit. Of course, you had mentioned, you envisioning seeing the changes to Section 2 here in the independent entity, which makes sense, and not in Section 6. And I have a couple of concerns there, but one of them is, I think, even if you read Section 6 separately and apart from Section 2, so okay, no entity, no, not creating any platform, that's fine. I think it's still vague. There's still a lot of lack of clarity in here around what is required of the manufacturer. So, for example, how long is the period of time access has to be granted? It says owner authorized, which I think it would actually be more like owner requested. and OEM authorized based on the conversations that's more of, sort of statutory cleanup language, but it's just something to think about. And then again, it says, upon authorization of the owner, again, maybe that's upon request of the owner and authorization of the manufacturer, something like that. My only, I guess, sort of question becomes around in terms of what the manufacturer is required to provide on lifetime vehicle data for maintenance. And by that, I mean, like, say, I take my car to, here's a good one, because they're no longer in business. And I used to take my car there spend thousands of dollars at Conroy's in Scarborough. If any of you ever installed Conroy's with the green dinosaur on the front, independent repair. And let's just say I had a new car and they were like, we want access to your car so we can fix repairs. And I, did the thing and was okay. What's not clear from this statute is whether or not that's permanent and ongoing. So like John Conroy, who was the owner, can he be in the office going down and looking and be like, oh, I see today Elizabeth's car, has low tire pressure and, could use an oil change. I'm going to send her a note, even if I haven't been in there in 6 months or not. And so there are some very substantive questions around what maintenance, I think mostly around maintenance and perhaps diagnostics. I think repair is fairly straightforward mean, and what that means for what the manufacturers need to actually do in order to comply. So I do want us to look at that if we have some time.
Yeah, Christina?
So we talked about that exact kind of issue. If the group is contemplating an advisory committee that doesn't yet, but may in the future request rulemaking authority to kind of fill in some of the blanks and some of the substantive terms, in the meantime, there may be a lot of questions. And I think that there is an opportunity now for this group, even if we go that route, to talk about certain very basic terms that, especially if there could be some consensus that everybody on this panel agrees, there shouldn't be access to a car while it's moving, or, there could be some very basic things that this committee now on the front end could build into some recommended changes to the statute in lieu of having the advisory council in the first instance have rulemaking authority, because they may not need a whole lot.
Right. Yes, that makes sense. Thank you.
Tommy, your light's on. Did you have something?
Yeah. We always, to no one's fault here, we always seem to be going in circles on this. To Elizabeth's question, it says specifically, as you keep reading, that this would be an owner authorized, so they could choose who gets their information and for how long. So some folks may want to share their information so that they're not in their independent repair shop for 6 months. Joe's Repair Shop can tell them about something that's happening. Some people may not feel comfortable doing that, so they can shut it off, just as phones have the ability to share location with your friends or whatnot. So I think that's pretty specific inside there. So having said that, I think that's pretty specific. Would it make sense to kind of go through the sheet that you had where we talked about, discussion status and discussion notes, so we can get the entity and then kind of figure out the other stuff later? Because we really feel like this working group was for the entity, and we kind of have some talking points that we should hammer out first.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Todd. But let me just go back. I mean, I agree that our charge isn't to amend the statute, except that we are going to be doing that or recommending that with respect to the entity. But I think it is fair in our report, and I think, Elizabeth, this is what you're getting at, is to the extent that members of this group think that there are ambiguities in the statute. I don't want to be in the place where we're rewriting the statute and actually like writing new language. But I think, Christina, this is what you were sort of getting at, is that I think it would be helpful in the report if if we flagged areas where people think there are ambiguities and then suggested that the legislature may either want to consider addressing those ambiguities itself or may want to task the independent entity with rulemaking authority to sort of flesh out those issues. But again, I don't want us to be rewriting paragraph 6, but I think it would probably be appropriate in the report to suggest that maybe there are some general areas that need to be clarified. Is that okay? And so Tommy, back to your, are you suggesting that we just go through the decision log or?
Yeah, I just feel like this is the only thing that we can kind of tangibly touch and see and feel. So it would probably make sense to kind of either get a consensus or not a consensus on these. That way, we're not moving from section 2 to section 6 back to section 2 type of, organizational structure here. That's just my recommendation, obviously.
Yeah,
leave it at your feet.
Is there any other discussion before we do that, or do folks, I think actually going through this decision log is going to be pretty straightforward, given that we're sort of envisioning an advisory role for this organization, but I think it is right to go through it. But are there any other comments or discussion that folks want to have? We can still have them in the context of the specific items, but just before we do that. Okay.
This is Brian Boggs. In section 6, I think there is an area that I'd like to have clarified. So if we can come back to it later, that would be great. I think it's small, but I think very important from a cybersecurity perspective. And we talked about it in a previous working group. So if we could just put that on this agenda for later or future agenda, I'm okay with that.
Yeah, Christina?
Yeah, sorry, I have an idea that in addition to the decision log that I think is going to be straightforward and we should go through just to make sure we all kind of have our heads in the same spot in terms of what the entity looks like. I think this last issue that just got touched on in terms of ambiguities in the statute that we want to flag in this report, I think we may be able to do it today, but I also think that would be good homework for people coming back next time to be able to develop a running list of the ambiguities that people think are real and important that we need to build into the report.
Yeah, I would just amplify that. I'm thinking that maybe if folks, if there are ambiguities that people want to see addressed, maybe if they could write those down, circulate them to the group before our next meeting so that people have a chance to think about it, and then we could take those up at our next meeting. Brian, does that make sense to you? Because I think that might be more productive than trying to have a discussion.
That sounds good.
Okay, great. All right, so why don't we just work through this decision log? A1, we're all set. We made the decision there. A2 is, will the entity be a gatekeeper for access to the data? And I think we all agree the answer to that is no. Okay. I'm just gonna, unless someone speaks up, I'll pause for a couple seconds, and if I don't hear any objections, I'm just gonna assume we have consensus. So A3 is, will the entity decide whether the manufacturer must grant access to the data for a specific request? I think the answer there is no. Okay. And again, these are all things that the independent entity, once it gets going, might decide it should have this authority. So I'm not saying that the independent entity is never going to have the authority to do these things. It may well decide that it should do some of these things, but we're just saying, at least initially, it's not going to be charged with that. Will the entity implement a credentialing or verification process? I think the answer there is no. Okay. So then A5 is not applicable. Will the entity establish a standardized process of accessing data across all manufacturers, or will each manufacturer implement its own process? I think we're envisioning the manufacturers will all implement their own process, of course, subject to the possibility that the independent entity might later decide that there needs to be a standardized access platform.
So I think this one's interesting because while I don't believe that the entity should have any kind of enforcement in how they standardize their makes and models, I do think that they need to and it goes kind of to this language here, I think they should be identifying standards in which comply with the law, because I think Christina pointed this out, like some manufacturers are going to say, no, I don't want to do this because I don't want to do this, or I don't know how to do this. And so that's where I think the entity, like identifying standards and acknowledging technology changes and things of that nature, I think will be helpful while not being rulemaking. So I know it's a small kind of nuance in this, but explaining a standardized process, perhaps not establishing.
So I'm not sure if I understand. I mean, it sounds like maybe you're saying that the entity could make sort of like recommendations or like best practice recommendations.
Yeah,
But they wouldn't be binding. So they'd be sort of suggestions to the manufacturers that the manufacturers could either take them or leave them.
yeah, and like in accordance with the Attorney General, I think this entity's purpose is to show ways that this law can be implemented using existing standards. So while we say things like, will each manufacturer implement its own, or will the entity establish, maybe not establish, but offer best practices for implementation.
I mean, I don't have a concern with that. Is there anyone who thinks, okay, yeah, Elizabeth?
Yeah, I guess if it's just like a recommendation of best practices that could go for review or educational purposes, I don't have a problem with that. If it's best practices that have to be followed that are a mandate, then that looks more like rulemaking.
And
So
I
just
agree.
raise
And
that
I think
question.
we're talking about just recommendations that would not be binding on manufacturers. Is that right, Tommy?
Yeah, just again, part of the process to show existing standards in which this could be meant to be implemented.
Yeah, I mean, as long as they're only recommendations that aren't binding, I don't see an issue with that. Is there anyone else who has a concern?
This is Brian Boggs. I would only see an issue if over time that becomes a slippery slope on the enforcement side, where there's confusion as to what is a recommendation versus what is a requirement. But if it's a recommendation only and that stays the way it is, that makes sense to me. Although that might imply there needs to be staff or other funding, as these systems are quite complicated and need expert input. So that might inform section C when we get to it.
Well, I'm wondering if maybe we should phrase this as the independent entity. And again, we'll make clear that these are just recommendations. These aren't binding, but instead of saying like shall offer best practices, may offer best practices. Because I think that's a fair point, Brian, that the independent entity just might not have the capability of doing that initially, at least. So maybe just leaving that as a may instead of a shall.
Yeah. Yeah, again, this would be to show best practices, something to point to, and some kind of, I know you talked about a report, it'd just be something to get the entity kind of on record to show these technologies that exist for implementation once again. So I'm fine with May, as long as it's in there.
And also, I just want to be clear that like this is sort of like a straw poll in a way. I'm not, going to say later, no, sorry, it's too late. You already agreed to this. Everyone's going to see a draft of the report, the draft legislation, and if when they see that, they have concerns, it's fair game still. So I don't want you to think that this is like the final decision being made right here. Yeah, Christina?
Yeah, I just have a question about how this process would work for developing best practices. For the committee to develop best practices, is there a chance that the members of the committee won't be able to agree on what best practices are? I mean, I just don't know if we are setting them up for failure, but I suppose if it's discretionary in any event, it doesn't matter if they don't come up with any because they can't agree on any, then that's okay. That's allowed under this law. Does that seem fair?
Yeah, Elizabeth.
I don't know the answer to your question, but you raise an interesting question. One of the areas I could see being problematic or troublesome for any group right now, and so maybe this is something, I can't remember if this person's on the original working group independent entity or not, but the area of data privacy, for example, right, which is so kind of fraught across all levels with interests, and that may be one where there isn't a clear best practice, or the industry doesn't agree with the consumer protection person. So that's one area where I could see maybe, you raise an interesting point, but I'm not sure how they would address that, but maybe there's a mechanism for that.
I mean, could you repeat the question here? Because I see this as when manufacturers ultimately say, I can't do this, I don't know how to do this. This entity of experts, and some of the folks we've actually had testify here, would show manufacturers ways that they can comply with the law. And it would be on record, and it would be the experts coming to a consensus, or not coming to a consensus. Maybe this is a majority report, maybe a minority report, be similar to this group to just bring to light that there are ways to implement this, and manufacturers either don't want to or have chosen not to, but not because they don't know how to.
All right, so for A6, at least what I have for now, subject to people's further thoughts, is that we're going to have some language that will suggest that this independent entity may offer best practices or standards or something as recommendations, as non-binding, non-mandatory recommendations, something along those lines. Is that okay? All right, so now we're to section B. B1, will the entity need to have rulemaking authority? I think the answer is no, at least not initially. Everyone okay with that? All right. Will the entity need to have enforcement authority? I would say no, but it will have the authority or the ability to refer matters to the AG for enforcement. Okay.
Could you maybe, oh, sorry.
Yeah, Elizabeth.
And maybe you could add in there, I was just trying to think maybe it's in the next one. If yes, what kind of authority? Maybe you could just make a note in there that, and I know this is on our list separately, but I think you do want to add that AG
Yeah.
should have its own authority as well, to raise it if something comes to your attention separately.
Yeah, so I think what we're saying is we think maybe we should clarify that enforcement language at the end of the statute to make clear that we don't have to do it just on recommendations from the entity, but we can do it if we get a complaint from a consumer or, yeah, okay. Yeah, Christina?
I also think part and parcel of this section of questions is what kind of authority does the entity have to informally resolve disputes, which is something that you and I were talking about, is something that this advisory committee should be able to do. Hear complaints, talk amongst themselves about the complaints, vet the complaints, try to informally resolve them. That's probably something that should be expressed, right? No?
Yeah, no, I think that's right.
So informal complaint resolution or something like that.
No, I think that's right. I think we should say that.
This is Brian Boggs. Informal complaint resolution sounds good. What I am envisioning, or what I already see as we interact with vehicles from a decade or two ago, is that unintended changes in software or web security best practices, or just an IT change takes place at a software service that we utilize, has some downstream complication where something's not working and it's pretty buried, and we benefit greatly from people asking us, hey, I want this access, but it's not working. And it's not that we took it away. It's that legitimately something in the long tool chain that may or may not actually be our tool chain stopped working. And like, there's no end date stated in this bill for how long does a vehicle manufacturer need to comply. So I've got a 1956 Buick. I still work on it. Like 50, 60, 70 years from now, somebody's going to be working on a 2022 Tesla. And this bill says that all this stuff needs to keep working indefinitely into the future, like long on a lifespan that is so much longer than like Windows 95. It's not around anymore. Windows NT, it's not around anymore. So I like the idea of having informal complaint, like a resolution where it's a much what I want is a positive, productive environment rather than only like a punitive conversation taking place.
You know, I agree, and I think that's the whole point of the dispute resolution is and again, this entity is going to be made up of folks from across the industry, so from different industries. So I think there is going to be value in them having the ability to sort of try to resolve these disputes informally.
Great.
All right, and then on to the next page. So will it be an independent board or commission or part of an existing agency? I haven't really completely thought this through, but I do see it as sort of a freestanding board or commission or something like that, that wouldn't really be housed within any part of state government. Although, I think it's going to need some sort of logistical support. I mean, it's going to need someone to set up the meetings and have the Zoom links and publish the agenda on the website. And so I think what Christina and I can do is we can talk with our boss about whether the AG's office might be able to provide that sort of just administrative support. But I don't think this entity would be housed within the AG's office. It would just be that our office would be providing some administrative support. Does that sound right to you, Christina?
Yeah,
Is
unless the BMV is dying to do it.
The BMV is not dying to do it. And one thing I will caution a board that we do have stuck under our auspices, it does have an attorney who works as the chair, and that person's salary is funded through assessments on the people who participate, the manufacturers and the franchise holders. But one of the, I will say from a personal experience perspective, lack of foresight was that there should have been some clerical support that, just for handling the logistics that just kind of gets shifted.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely, if we're contemplating that the AG's office might be able to provide that support, I mean, whether we can just absorb it or whether it be a tiny fiscal note maybe, or just to be able to make sure that it's explicit in the statute authorizing the entity that it needs clerical support.
And it might be something that maybe we can provide some support for like the first year and we see how it goes, but then maybe one of the recommendations for year 2 is going to be they need to have some more support. Yeah. And so C2 is, will there be staff? We were envisioning no, at least not right away, other than whatever administrative support will be given to them either through our office or somewhere else, but we're not envisioning them having like an executive director or anything like that. Is that consistent? Okay. And so I don't think they're really gonna need funding, although, I mean, I know what most boards and commissions, there's like a per diem that's paid to members for coming to meetings. So I think, we might want to think about providing whatever the standard per diem is, and maybe, I don't know, they get mileage maybe, or I'm not really sure about that, but whatever members of other kinds of commissions get in terms of sort of expenses, we probably would want to provide that here, but I'm not envisioning that we'd be paying the members a salary or anything, that this would be something that they'd be doing on a volunteer basis. And then so we don't really need to talk about the funding, how it would be funded. So I guess a couple other things, and since it's still kind of early, maybe we can run through this now, but I mean, I think we do need to figure out who's going to be on this entity. And maybe if we just started with like this working group, I don't know that the Attorney General's office needs to be part of the working group. In fact, it might not be appropriate for them to be part of it since we're going to be getting referrals. But maybe, so maybe like if we took this working group here and we subtracted the AG's office, is there anyone else who should be either subtracted or added to it? If you understand my question.
Who would convene it? That would be the kind of issue we'd have. Would there be like a chairman or?
That's a good question. I
I
think one particular member should probably be considered the chair. And I don't know if I don't know if like the Secretary of State's office would be if they envision being part of this entity or not.
This is Lynn. I would have to confer with the secretary and with Deputy Secretary Curtis. I will say that this is outside of our mission. It's not something that naturally fits with, all of where we're focusing our resources and what we do.
Yeah, no, that's fair.
Yeah.
I think, I mean, I think we need to designate a chair, and the chair has to be sort of like a neutral party. Like, I don't think the chair can be from one of the industries. So, I mean, if the Secretary of State's office is going to be participating, it sort of doesn't make sense maybe for that member to be the chair. Unless, I don't know, unless there's some other like neutral member. I mean, there could be something like where maybe the governor designates someone who serves as chair. Yeah, Christina.
Well, I was definitely thinking that there should be appointing authorities to appoint the various constituencies that should be represented on the body. I'm not clear, Lynn, from your comment, whether you think that it makes sense for the Secretary of State to be represented on the body. I wasn't sure, or whether you were just talking about the chair, not that wouldn't make sense.
I'm not, to be honest, it's not clear to me what the Secretary of State's, I guess, position on any of these issues would be, or what their concern would be in a sense, because it is not really, it doesn't align within our mission of what we do.
But maybe as an appointing authority, or does that still just not make sense because there's not much relevance to the work you do?
I think I might have to think about that, but I know even with the Motor Vehicle Franchise Board, other than the chair who is appointed by the secretary, who is the paid position, the rest of it's appointed by the governor.
I mean, I really did see that the AG would probably have someone that could convene this, because at the end of the day, the entity has to work with the AG in terms of what the AG's powers are versus the entity. But while I understand that aspect of it, perhaps a appointee, a retired judge, someone along those lines that is kind of an expertise in facilitating something like this, I think it would be appropriate.
Yeah, I think Christina, I can think about this some more. I mean, I think we need to figure out, well, let me ask this question, I guess. In terms of who is going to be the appointing authority, I mean, we're going to have slots. So we're going to say, for example, there are going to be, 2 people representing independent repair facilities, 2 people representing car manufacturers. Who is going to appoint those people? I don't think it should be the Attorney General's office, maybe not the Secretary of State's office. Yeah, Jeff, you.
So some thoughts about that. So when you look at the statutory language, it says the independent entity must consist of 1 representative. So those are people that must be on it unless that language changes. But it's not mutually exclusive to other people. So, what I would envision is, for those industry people, that you might have the Auto Care Association nominate somebody who would fulfill a certain role, or the Alliance nominate somebody from the manufacturers that would fill a certain role. And then for the other members of the committee, you would have those appointed by, whoever you decide to, whether it's the Secretary of State or the Attorney General's office or the governor or whoever else.
Yeah, Elizabeth.
Thanks. I guess that would be an unusual, I'm not sure that I've ever seen anything quite like, there would have to be an unusual degree of specificity in the way that those members are laid out, so that you're like, you can choose the Auto Care Association, but if you do so, you're doing so to the exclusion of other small groups that might have the same mission and fit within that same terminology. So I think you'd have to have really clear definitions that like clearly only indicate one party, so that you're sure to only get that party. I mean, I think typically it's, the governor, the president of the Senate, the House, the Speaker of the House. That's how these things are usually done. I guess I would just feel a little uncomfortable without any kind of like government or regulatory guidance on who's doing that appointing. Choosing from within those groups is fine. But I think having those own groups choose from within themselves necessarily, precludes people who aren't in the room potentially, and doesn't give that opportunity to elected officials to look at the entire room and make that choice. So I think that would be my thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of was thinking the same thing as Elizabeth, which typically it is like the governor, the senator, the president of the Senate, the Speaker of the House that make these appointments. I don't know if in this case, maybe they're all gubernatorial appointments. I don't know. We can think about that some more. In terms of the makeup, I mean, are folks with sort of asterisks next to the AG's office and the Secretary of State's office, is sort of the makeup of this group appropriate for the entity? So I think that's what it's two automotive manufacturers, two independent repair, an aftermarket parts distributor, an aftermarket parts manufacturer, a new car dealer, privacy, consumer advocacy group. Did I miss anyone? Are folks comfortable with that kind of composition?
Had you mentioned cybersecurity?
Yeah, I think I was sort of thinking like cybersecurity / privacy. I was kind of combining that, but yeah, you're right. So cybersecurity / privacy.
And I'm sure you touched on it, but one of the things that we've kind of touched on last session was this idea of a third-party authenticator. I know a lot of cybersecurity companies, privacy companies do both of those, but I think that's something that would be really important as we implement this law.
Sorry, can I?
Yeah, Elizabeth.
I think I just need clarification. We're talking about a third party doing what exactly?
The authentication. So we talked about who would be dictating who gets the information as a manufacturer, as this entity. A third party authenticator would be the one that would be administering who has the access to it. And so those are something that manufacturers already use, third party authenticators in their information giving.
Some of them do.
Right. So that would be something that we should put on this entity to explore ways that this could be kind of a third party to make sure that it's not the manufacturers or the independent repairers fighting over it.
To me, that sounds like a
interesting because at the
subset.
last meeting, I asked if manufacturers were going to be able to be the ones finally authorizing control, and the answer was yes. So I feel like that's changed.
Yeah, we would never feel comfortable with the manufacturers dictating who gets information and who doesn't.
Okay, that was not the answer that was given in the last meeting.
No, this would be something that the third party administrators would be involved in.
Okay, we have a serious problem with that.
Yeah, let's back up. I'm not sure I followed that either, Tommy. So
Sure. So
my understanding was that the manufacturers will be giving the access directly to people who request it.
no, I think the manufacturers already use third party administrators. So they use third party administrators and how they handle their information. So
Some of them do.
right.
You're
So
talking about forcing them all to do it.
what I'm talking about is putting a third party administrator inside of this entity to explain things that services they offer to make sure that
That's
the
not
level
what you
playing
just said.
field is there. So I just did.
You're
We're talking
saying you're
about
gonna-
who's putting on this entity. That's what we just offered. We just
Okay, so
offered
now
who's going to sit
okay,
on
so
this.
now the entity is back in the position of authorizing data.
No,
Because if that
we just
person-
said to put a third party authenticator on this entity.
What about this idea instead? I mean, if the entity decides that, that third party authentication is something that they think could be helpful, they would always be free to invite in people to make presentations to them on third party authentication. I'm just not sure that like putting a third party authenticator on the entity itself makes a lot of sense. Because it sounds like, what you're saying is that they might find it helpful to get input from someone like that.
Yeah, I'm saying to offer their services in implementing this law would be a third party authenticator. That would be the purpose of them.
This is Brian Boggs. I feel like the expertise that such a group would provide just comes into the scope that we already mentioned of a cybersecurity / privacy expert. Like the authentication is a subset of the world of cybersecurity. So is that not already encompassed within the member providing expertise on cybersecurity?
No, absolutely. I think that could be covered inside that exact definition of cybersecurity for sure.
Okay, so are we okay then? We'll have a cybersecurity / privacy person but not a separate third-party authenticator.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay.
Maybe two.
Yeah.
To privacy, cybersecurity?
Yeah, how many manufacturer? How many of the other slots were you contemplating? One or two?
Well, so there's two manufacturers, there's two independent repair, there's aftermarket parts manufacturer, aftermarket parts distributor, new car dealer, and then like consumer advocacy.
Yeah, and cybersecurity / privacy, privacy with a cybersecurity emphasis seems more neutral than the other components, putting aside consumer advocacy. So I think they should get at least as much weight because it just seems like that would be a slightly more neutral
Yeah.
constituency. Megan has thoughts on this.
I think what I'm struggling with is that privacy and design is crucial to making sure that people's information is protected. And I just have, I mean, maybe a cybersecurity is, I can see that being separate because they have expertise. But as a general privacy advocate, I have felt a little bit like my involvement or my expertise adding to this group is like this much, and maybe Katrina feels differently. So I could see being brought in to develop policies and think about policies, but to be part of a group every meeting and to be part of contacting auto manufacturers feels like outside the scope of that. So in that, the investigation part feels a little separate, but it's really crucial to have privacy baked into the design of the group and have DV advocates talking about making sure that people are not using this group to get at people's information in a way that they shouldn't be, making sure that people are not using this information for purposes that are illegitimate. So putting too many privacy people, I just think you're adding work without necessarily bringing expertise or benefit to the everyday functions, but the setting up of the group, that's a different matter.
Well, is there such thing as a subset of cybersecurity that is focused on kind of vehicles and telematics? I mean, it makes sense if there are experts in that field, which I imagine there are, Katrina, maybe but it seems like that type of expertise would be really helpful. And then maybe in addition, also kind of like privacy policy expertise. I'm just spitballing because we're having this conversation now.
Yeah, I don't know specifically whether cybersecurity experts with, specific expertise in automobile cybersecurity, but I do think I agree with Megan. I think it's going to be hard to find someone with deep enough expertise in cybersecurity and privacy in one person that would be beneficial to the group. I think cybersecurity is a very important piece of this, but I don't know that it needs to be within this group. Like, I think that's going to be something that's happening when these systems are being built, but where the privacy expertise is more specific to, what Maine is prioritizing when they're moving this forward.
Hey, Jeff?
It's Jeff Groves. It seems to me that the fundamental issue is that the consumer be able to know what data, what do they want to be able to control their data, who gets their data, who has access to their data. So in this context, with respect to this piece of legislation, we're talking about diagnostic and repair data. So it's a limited subset with respect to privacy anyway. I mean, there are a lot of things that telematics does with data that is not contemplated with this that people probably really should be concerned about. But I think I agree that as long as really the focus is on making sure that the consumer is the one who authorizes, the release of whatever diagnostic and repair information to whomever they choose, I think as long as you protect that, I don't know that you're going to have too many other privacy issues with respect to this subset of data.
Yeah, and I think, just to go back in history a little bit, I think the original citizen initiated bill, I don't think had a privacy or cybersecurity person. And I think those got added to this group because there was a lot of concern that the independent entity was going to be managing all of this data. And so people were rightfully concerned about that. But now that we know that that's not going to be the case, maybe there's less of a need for cybersecurity privacy people as part of the entity, although certainly the entity could hear from those people as it's trying to develop sort of recommendations to the legislature going forward. So I'm not sure where that leaves us. Do we want any privacy / cybersecurity person on, or?
I would probably like language specifying that they should advise with privacy folks. I think it is important to keep privacy in mind from the beginning. And if we just take it out completely, it's too easy to not think about it. So I would like I would suggest some language about seeking counsel from privacy experts. And again, I include in that DV victim advocates. I'm really concerned about folks who don't have control over the car. Like if you bring your car into a dealer, you have control over the car. And so there is some thought that if you're on, if you own the car and you have control, that you have authority to be looking at it. But if you don't, I'm concerned about people trying to use this in an illegitimate way. On the other hand, that concern is not so big that you need a privacy person necessarily on the body, but I would want them to advise the body so that when they set up rules about how they're going to determine who has access, that's part of the design.
And Katrina, can I put you on the spot? So are you at the same place? Like, do you feel a need for someone like yourself to be part of this entity as opposed to being someone that would be called upon to consult with potentially?
No, I agree with Megan. I think if it's explicit in there that the entity has to take, privacy, in particular, she mentioned privacy of domestic violence victims into account, that is sufficient. I don't necessarily think it has to be someone on the body.
Okay.
This is Brian Boggs. On the privacy side, I see in my role, I'm constantly presented with questions that come up that have to deal with data privacy and what information is made available remotely or that is not available remotely, or what frequency the information is made available, for how long it is made available, how long is it retained. So I would say large chunks of my day are spent thinking about the privacy implications of the repair and maintenance information that we as a vehicle manufacturer make available to both independent and franchise dealerships in local and remote settings. So I would find it odd if the independent entity lacked some data privacy expertise. I would also find it odd if it lacked some cybersecurity specific expertise as it's charged with managing cybersecure access to motor vehicles. And although we talk often about that this is an owner authorized platform, there are times when is the owner not the owner? A man in the middle attack, a relay attack, a phishing attack. Phishing attacks are also like overlapping into the world of data privacy that I envision this entity and vehicle manufacturers and independent repairers being presented with challenges in the coming years of the vehicle owner like truly knowing and trusting when they're getting an electronic request to authorize some individual that they're not physically present in the same location as to access their vehicles. Is this a real attempt, or is this one of the million text messages they get every day about their motor vehicle warranty expiring, which is just some scammer? So I think the entity would benefit from both expertise in cybersecurity and separately like expertise in data privacy.
Brian, if the entity is not itself going to be managing access to the data or administering the platform, I guess I'm not really following like why it would be important for them to have those kind of folks part of the group. Because ultimately it's going to be the manufacturers that are going to be deciding who they're going to, turn, like, they're going to be deciding whether someone is authentic and whether or not this in fact is a person entitled to the data.
Perhaps I'm thinking of it in the complaint or dispute resolution forum, that as the group, as the entity is digging into what is taking place and trying to distinguish, there might be a misunderstanding that the information is made available to independent repairers when locally connected to the car, and same with authorized dealers, but that it's not available to anyone when remotely connected to the car. And the entity might be discussing, well, should it be available? Why isn't it available? And those discussions might be informed by considering the data privacy or cybersecurity implications of if the information were to be made available remotely.
Yeah, Christina?
Yeah, I could think of another example too. It might be kind of ludicrous, but the body gets a complaint about a manufacturer not allowing access to an individual because the individual hasn't proved to the manufacturer's satisfaction that the individual is who the individual says the individual is. And so it would be helpful to have somebody on the body, I suppose, be able to assess, well, what is reasonable to require. I mean, that seems like an extreme example, but I guess I can contemplate that there might be situations like that where it would be helpful to have data privacy people on board.
Yeah, Elizabeth?
I just wanted to raise, I know we're talking about, we're essentially talking about these folks who are going to be doing two things, putting together, recommended best practices, generally looking at meeting and talking about those things, and then looking at potential conflicts and maybe need for enforcement. And so I guess in the designing of best practices, I agree that there's probably a need for all this stuff. It's just, I guess I just want to caution us about our language, because the more we talk about it, the more it sounds like the entity is designing the standards by which the manufacturer is going to have to obey, which is not where we landed an hour and a half ago.
I guess I was seeing it more as having the skills to evaluate whether or not a manufacturer is reasonably withholding access.
Yeah, okay. That makes sense.
So where are we? Are we thinking that we need sort of a privacy and a cybersecurity person, or one or the other?
Well, we had both Katrina and Megan kind of suggest we didn't need it. I'm wondering if the conversation we've had since has changed your mind at all, or are you still of the view that we don't really need that expertise on the panel?
Chris?
To throw this in here, for a dealer to communicate with a manufacturer, they have to approve what system we have. And there's only like 4 or 5 of them out there. And if you don't, we're with Reynolds and Reynolds. If we went with them, we couldn't communicate with them because Reynolds guarantees certain things that the manufacturer does. The other thing too is that every year they send out a questionnaire to make sure who the administrator is, what kind of software we have. So when they download, when they're working on a car and they're doing a flash or something, it has to be secured. And I could see where the manufacturers may want someone with some kind of expertise, because if they're going to give out data to someone's laptop somewhere, they're going to want to make sure that laptop is secured. Who is control of it? And how do they, what's the software that they have to make sure that it's secured? So something you may want to, rethink a little bit, because it costs us thousands of dollars a month to have this protection so that so we can communicate with them. It costs Quirk almost $1 million a year to do this. So I'm pretty sure they're gonna want something like that.
Well, maybe, do folks just want to maybe think about this issue before our next meeting? I mean, it does seem like we're getting to a place where we probably need to have some kind of privacy and or cybersecurity person on. I definitely see the wisdom in that, especially as Brian and Christina were saying, to handle complaint issues. But maybe we just need to think a little bit more about that. Is that okay? And then I think Christina and I will also give some thought to how we would have a chair. And we'll see if we can come up with some proposals before our next meeting that we could circulate. Any other issues, Christina, you can think of that we should, I mean, I think we've made a ton of progress. I think we're pretty close to being able to put something in draft together. In fact, I think we could probably even do it for our next meeting. There'll be some holes to fill, like the membership and the chair and maybe some other things, but I think we can probably get a pretty good start and have that circulated for folks before our December 2nd meeting. Any other thoughts or things people think we need to address or we should talk about? Let me put this out there, just while I'm thinking about it, and maybe if folks can just be thinking, there are a couple places in the statute that I think are some like sort of typos, and I think that because I compared it to the Massachusetts statute, and it's a little bit different, and the Massachusetts one makes a little bit more sense in a couple areas. So one of the things that's kind of odd about the statute is it has a provision for model year 2002 motor vehicles. And that's paragraph 3. And then it has a provision for model year 2002 to 2017 motor vehicles. And then it has a provision for 2018 and later motor vehicles. And I think from Massachusetts, maybe the way this was supposed to work is that maybe paragraph 3 should be model year 2002 and thereafter motor vehicles. I don't think the intent was to limit that just to that 1 year of motor vehicles. So I don't know, Tommy, maybe you could take a look at that.
Yeah, I mean, all I can tell you is that from the model years 2022 to what is it, for 2018, that was all agreed upon language in the MOU. So that those wouldn't be typos. That would be language that was agreed upon with the car manufacturers for the OBD port in 2013.
Yeah, and all I can say is that in the Massachusetts statute, it does say for model year 2002 motor vehicles and thereafter. And so that's why I was thinking that it should have been the same there. And then the other thing that I think maybe is a typo is in paragraph 5, which is talking about model year 2018 and later motor vehicles. It has it says that the onboard diagnostic and repair information must be available through the use of an off-the-shelf personal computer with sufficient memory, speed, connectivity, and other capabilities as specified by the vehicle manufacturer. And then it goes through these 3 different things, A, B, and C. I think that and after B should be an or. I think the intent, and again, I'm looking at the Massachusetts statute to get there, but I don't think the intent was that all 3 of those things have to be provided. I think the intent was that at least one of those things has to be provided. So do you follow what I'm saying, Tommy?
I can take a look.
Yeah,
Again,
I just think maybe that and is supposed to be an or, that you have to do one of those 3 things, not all 3 of those things. So I'm just wondering if you could just take a look at that.
I agree with that interpretation because B is kind of mutually exclusive of A and C. And so having it be a and is odd. And to me, it seems it should be an or.
Yeah. So yeah, if you could just look into that, Tommy, because that might be something that we'd want to recommend changing. All right. Any other comments or questions or things people want to, yeah, let me go Elizabeth first.
Just a short one. We've talked about doing this before, so I think everyone agrees we should, but I just don't want us to lose it. Maybe planning a public comment period for like when the final report, but maybe before, I don't know, at some point before we release the report is really.
Yeah,
long.
that's a good idea. Maybe we have a draft report that we
Yeah.
allow the public to comment on
Yeah.
before we finalize it.
Yep.
Does that make sense to everyone? Yeah, I think that's a good idea. I like that. Thank you.
Chris?
Yeah. Let me just go to Christina. Okay, Jack.
Yeah, you gonna send us an email on what you, for our homework?
Oh, I was good. That's what I was gonna say. So my thinking was, we already talked about, if people could send us a list of what they see as ambiguities in the statute that this body could recommend, clarifications on. So that's one piece of homework for the group. And then the other is, Chris, along the lines of your note about some of these seemingly inconsistent provisions, which aren't technically ambiguities, but if people have other things in that category too, that you flagged, that would be really helpful for us to know. And are you saying, Jack, it would be helpful if we send you guys an email,
Just
kind of to tee it up
yes,
in your
yep,
inbox?
Yeah, we
Okay.
can do that. Anything else? All right, and so on our end, we are going to think about the chair issue. We will we'll think about the administrative support. There was another big one that and we'll start working on a draft report. Yeah. An appointment authority. Yep, exactly. Yep. All right. Any other business? We're adjourned. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.